Good morning and welcome to Adult Formation at Christ Church, and we're doing a little ad-lib this morning. I wasn't expected to read, but I am going to read for you today some material by Annie Dillard, who is a woman of faith, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1954. And I'm just going to go right into the reading. And this is called An Expedition to the Pole from her book called Teaching a Stone to Talk. There is a singing group in this Catholic church today, a singing group which calls itself Wildflowers. The lead is a tall, square-jawed teenage boy, buoyant and glad to be here. He carries a guitar. He plucks out a little bluesy riff and hits some chords. With him are the rest of the Wildflowers. There is an old woman, wonderfully determined. She has long orange hair and is dressed country and western style. A long embroidered strap around her neck slings a big western guitar low over her pelvis. Beside her stands a frail, withdrawn 14-year-old boy and a large Chinese man in his 20s who seems to want to enjoy himself, but is not quite sure how to. He looks around wildly as he sings and shuffles his feet. There is also a very tall teenage girl, presumably the lead singer's girlfriend. She is delicate of feature, half serene and half petrified, a wispy soprano. They straggle out in front of the altar and teach us a brand new hymn. It all seems a pity at first, for I have overcome a fiercely anti-Catholic upbringing in order to attend Mass simply and solely to escape Protestant guitars. Why am I here? Who gave these nice Catholics guitars? Why are they not mumbling in Latin and performing superstitious rituals? What is the Pope thinking of? But nobody said things were going to be easy. A taste for the sublime is a greed like any other, after all. Why begrudge the churches their secularism now, when from the general table is rising a general song? Besides, in a way I do not pretend to understand, these people, all the people and all the ludicrous churches have access to the land. The land. The pole of relative inaccessibility is that imaginary point on the Arctic Ocean farthest from land in any direction. It is a navigator's paper point contrived to console Arctic explorers who, after Peary and Henson reached the North Pole in 1909, had nowhere special to go. There is a pole of relative inaccessibility on the Antarctic continent also. It is that point of land farthest from salt water in any direction. The absolute is the pole of relative inaccessibility located in metaphysics. After all, one of the few things we know about the absolute is that it is relatively inaccessible. It is that point of spirit farthest from every accessible point of spirit in all directions. Like the others, it is a pole of the most trouble. It is also, I take this as given, the pole of great price, the people. It is the second Sunday in Advent. For a year, I have been attending Mass at this Catholic church. Every Sunday for a year, I have run away from home and joined the circus as a dancing bear. We dancing bears have dressed ourselves in buttoned clothes. We mince around the rings on 2 feet. Today, we were restless. We kept dropping onto our forepaws. No one, least of all the organist, could find the opening hymn. Then no one knew it. Then no one could sing anyway. There was no sermon, only announcements. The priest proudly introduced the rascally acolyte who was going to light the 2 Advent candles. As we all could plainly see, the rascally acolyte had already lighted them. During the long intercessory prayer, the priest always reads intentions from the parishioners. These are slips of paper dropped into a box before the service begins, on which people have written their private concerns, requesting our public prayers. The priest reads them one by one, and we respond on cue. For a baby safely delivered on November 20th, the priest intoned. We pray to the Lord. We all responded, Lord, hear our prayer. Suddenly, the priest broke in and confided to our bowed heads, that's the baby we've been praying for the past 2 months. The woman just kept getting more and more pregnant. How shockingly often, have I exhausted myself in church from the effort to keep from laughing out loud. I often laugh all the way home. Then the priest read the next intention. For my son, that he may forgive his father, we pray to the Lord. Lord, hear our prayer, we responded, chastened. A high school stage play is more polished than this service we have been rehearsing since the year 1. In 2,000 years, we have not worked out the kinks. We positively glorify them. Week after week, we witness the same miracle, that God is so mighty, he can stifle his own laughter. Week after week, we witness the same miracle, that God, for reasons unfathomable, refrains from blowing our dancing bear act to smithereens. Week after week, Christ washes the disciples' dirty feet, handles their very toes, and repeats, it is all right, believe it or not, to be people. Who can believe it? During communion, the priest handed me a wafer, which proved to be stuck to 5 other wafers. I waited while he tore the clump into rags of wafer, resisting the impulse to help. Directly to my left and all through communion, a woman was banging out the theme from The Sound of Music on the piano. The land. 19th century explorers set the pattern for polar expeditions. Elaborately provisioned ships set out for high latitudes. Soon they encountered the pack ice and equinoctial storms. Ice coats the deck, spars, and rigging. The masts and hull shudder. The sea freezes around the rudder and then fastens on the ship. Early sailors try ramming, sawing, or blasting the ice ahead of the ship before they give up and settle in for the winter. In the 19th century, this being beset in the pack often killed polar crews. Later, explorers expected it and learned, finally, to put it to use. Sometimes officers and men move directly into the pack ice for safety. They drive tent stakes into the ice and pile wooden boxes about for tables and chairs. Sooner or later, the survivors of that winter or the next, or a select polar party sets off over the pack ice on foot. Depending on circumstances, they are looking either for a pole or, more likely, for help. They carry supplies, including boats, on sledges which they man-haul on ropes fastened to shoulder harnesses. South Polar expeditions usually begin from a base camp established on shore. In either case, the terrain is so rough and the men so weakened by scurvy that the group makes only a few miles a day. Sometimes they find an island on which to live or starve the next winter. Sometimes they turn back to safety, stumble onto some outpost of civilization, or are rescued by another expedition. Very often, when warm weather comes and the pack ice splits into floes, they drift and tent on a floe or hop from floe to floe until the final floe lands, splits, or melts. In 1847, according to Arctic historian L.P. Kerwin, the American ship Polaris was struck by an enormous floe, and just as stores, records, clothing, equipment were being flung from the reeling ship, she was swept away through the Arctic twilight with most, but not all, of her crew on board. Those left behind drifted for 1,300 miles on an ice floe until they were rescued, starving and dazed, off the coast of Labrador. Polar explorers were chosen as astronauts are today, from the clamoring, competitive ranks of the sturdy, skilled, and sane. Many of the British leaders, in particular, were men of astonishing personal dignity. Reading their accounts of life in extremis, one is struck by their unending formality toward each other. When Scott's Captain Oates sacrificed himself on the Antarctic Peninsula because his ruined feet were slowing the march, he stepped outside the tent one night to freeze himself in a blizzard, saying to the others, "I am just going outside and maybe sometime." Even in the privacy of their journals and diaries, polar explorers maintain a fine reserve. In his journal, Ernest Shackleton described his feelings upon seeing for the first time in human history the Antarctic continent beyond the mountains ringing the Ross ice shelf. He says, "We watched the new mountains rise from the great unknown that lay ahead of us," he wrote, "with feelings of keen curiosity, not unmingled with awe." One wonders, after reading a great many of such first-hand accounts, if polar explorers were not somehow chosen for the empty and solemn splendor of their prose styles, or even if some eminent Victorians, examining their own prose styles, realized, perhaps dismayed, that from the look of it, they would have to go in for polar exploration. Solomon André, the doomed Swedish balloonist, was dying of starvation on an Arctic island when he confides in his diary, with almost his dying breath, "Our provisions must soon and richly be supplemented if we are to have any prospect of being able to hold on for a time." The people. The new Episcopalian and Catholic liturgies include a segment called Passing the Peace. Many things can go wrong here. I know of one congregation in New York which fired its priest because he insisted on their passing of the peace, which involves nothing more than shaking hands with your neighbors in the pew. The men and women of this small congregation had limits to their endurance. Passing the peace was beyond their limits. They could not endure shaking hands with people to whom they bore lifelong grudges. They fired the priest and found a new one sympathetic to their needs. The rubric for passing the peace requires that one shake hands with whoever is handy and say, "Peace be with you." The other responds, "Peace be with you." Every rare once in a while, someone responds simply, "Peace." Today, I was sitting beside two teenage lugs with small mustaches. When it came time to pass the peace, I shook hands with one of the lugs and said, "Peace be with you." And he said, "Yeah." The technology, the Franklin expedition. The Franklin expedition was the turning point in Arctic exploration. The expedition itself accomplished nothing, and all its members died. But the expedition's failure to return and the mystery of its whereabouts attracted so much publicity in Europe and the United States that 30 ships sent out looking for traces of the ship and men. These search parties explored and mapped the Arctic for the first time, found the Northwest Passage, which Franklin had sought, and developed a technology adapted to Arctic conditions, a technology capable of bringing explorers back alive. The technology of the Franklin expedition, by contrast, was adapted only to conditions in the Royal Navy's officers' clubs in England. The Franklin expedition stood on its dignity. In 1845, Sir John Franklin and 138 officers and men embarked from England to find the Northwest Passage across the high Canadian Arctic to the Pacific Ocean. They sailed in 2 three-masted barks. Each sailing vessel carried an auxiliary steam engine and a 12-day supply of coal for the entire projected 2 or 3 years of voyage. Instead of additional coal, according to L.P. Kerwin, each ship made room for a 1,200-volume library, a hand organ playing 50 tunes, china place settings for officers and men, cut glass wine goblets, and sterling silver flatware. The officers' sterling silver knives, forks, and spoons were particularly interesting. The silver was of ornate Victorian design, very heavy at the handles and richly patterned. Engraved on the handles were the individual officers' initials and family crests. The expedition carried no special clothing for the Arctic, only the uniforms of Her Majesty's Navy. The ships set out in high dudgeon amid enormous glory and fanfare. Franklin uttered his utterance. "The highest object of my desire is faithfully to perform my duty." 2 months later, a British whaling captain met the two barks in Lancaster Sound. He reported back to England on the high spirits of officers and men. He was the last European to see any of them alive. Years later, civilization learned that many groups of Inuit Eskimos had hazarded a cross tableau involving various still living or dead members of the Franklin expedition. Some had glimpsed, for instance, men pushing and pulling a wooden boat across the ice. Some had found at a place called Starvation Cove this boat or a similar one and the remains of the 35 men who had been dragging it. At Terror Bay, the Inuit found a tent on the ice and in it 30 bodies. At Simpson Strait, some Inuit had seen a very odd sight: the pack ice pierced by the 3 protruding wooden masts of a bark. For 20 years, search parties recovered skeletons from all over the frozen sea. Franklin himself, it was learned after 12 years, had died aboard ship. Franklin dead, the ships frozen in the pack winter after winter, their supplies exhausted, the remaining officers and men had decided to walk to help. They outfitted themselves from ship's stores for the journey. Their bodies were found with those supplies they had chosen to carry. Accompanying one clump of frozen bodies, for instance, which incidentally showed evidence of cannibalism, were place settings of sterling silver flatware engraved with officers' initials and family crests. A search party found on the ice far from the ships a letter clip and a piece of that very backgammon board which Lady Jane Franklin had given her husband as a parting gift. Another search party found 2 skeletons in a boat on a sledge. They had hauled the boat 65 miles. With the 2 skeletons were some chocolate, some guns, some tea, and a great deal of table silver. Many miles south of these 2 was another skeleton alone. This was a frozen officer. In his pocket, he had, according to Kerwin, a parody of a sea chanty. The skeleton was in uniform, trousers and jacket, of fine blue cloth edged with silk braid, with sleeves slashed and bearing 5 covered buttons each. Over this uniform, the dead man had worn a blue greatcoat with a black silk neckerchief. That was the Franklin expedition. Sir Robert Falcon Scott, who died on the Antarctic Peninsula, was never able to bring himself to use dogs, let alone feed them to each other or eat them. Instead, he struggled with English ponies, for whom he carried hay. Scott felt that eating dogs was inhumane. He also felt, as he himself wrote, that when men reach a pole unaided, their journey has a fine conception and the conquest is more nobly and splendidly won. It is this loftiness of sentiment, this purity, this dignity and self-control, which makes Scott's farewell letters, found under his body, such moving documents. Less moving are documents from successful polar expeditions. Their leaders relied on native technology, which, as every book ever written about the Inuit puts it, was adapted to harsh conditions. Roald Amundsen, who returned in triumph from the South Pole, traveled Inuit style. He made good speed using sleds and feeding dogs to dogs on a schedule. Robert E. Peary and Matthew Henson reached the North Pole in the company of 4 Inuit. Throughout the Peary expedition, the Inuit drove the dog teams, built igloos, and supplied seal and walrus clothing. There is no such thing as a solitary polar explorer, fine as the conception is. the people. I had been attending Catholic Mass for only a year. Before that, the handiest church was congregational. Week after week, I climbed the long steps to that little church, entered, and took a seat with some few of my neighbors. Week after week, I was moved by the pitiableness of the bare linoleum-floored sacristy with no flowers could cheer or soften, by the terrible singing I so loved, by the fatigued Bible readings, the lagging emptiness and dilution of the liturgy, the horrifying vacuity of the sermon, and by the fog of dreary senselessness pervading the whole, which existed alongside and probably caused the wonder of the fact that we came. We returned. We showed up week after week. We went through it. Once, while we were reciting the Gloria, a farmer's wife, whom I knew slightly, and I exchanged a sudden triumphant glance. Recently, I returned to that congregational church for an ecumenical service. A Catholic priest and the minister served grape juice communion. Both the priest and the minister were professionals, were old hands. They bungled with dignity and aplomb. Both were at ease and awed. Both were half confident and controlled and half bewildered and whispering. I could hear them. Where is it? Have you got it? I thought you had it. The priest, new to me, was in his 60s. He was tall. He wore his weariness loosely, standing upright and controlling his breath. When he knelt at the altar and when he rose from kneeling, his knees cracked. It was a fine church music, the sounds of his cracking knees. The Lamb. Polar explorers, one gathers from their accounts, sought at the poles something of the sublime. Simplicity and purity attracted them. They set out to perform clear tasks in uncontaminated lands. The land's austerity held them. They praised the land's spare beauty, as if it were a moral or a spiritual quality. Icy halls of cold sublimity, lofty peaks perfectly covered with the eternal snow. Fridtjof Nansen referred to the great adventure of the ice, deep and pure as infinity, the eternal round of the universe and its eternal death. Everywhere polar prose evokes these absolutes, these ideas of eternity and perfection, as if they were some perfectly visible part of the landscape. They went, I say, partly in search of the sublime, and they found it the only way it can be found, here or there, around the edges, tucked into the corners of the days. For they were people, all of them, even the British. And despite the purity of their conceptions, they man-hauled their humanity to the poles. They man-hauled their frail flesh to the poles and encountered conditions so difficult that, for instance, it commonly took members of Scott's South Polar Party several hours each morning to put on their boots. Day and night, they did miserable, niggling, and often fatal battle with frostbitten toes, diarrhea, bleeding gums, hunger, weakness, mental confusion, and despair. They man-hauled their sweet human absurdity to the poles. When Robert E. Peary and Matthew Henson reached the North Pole in 1909, Peary planted there in the frozen ocean, according to L.P. Kerwin, the flag of the Deeks, the colors of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity at Bowdoin College, of which Peary was an alumnus. Polar explorers must adapt to conditions. They must adapt, on the one hand, to severe physical limitations. They must adapt, on the other hand, like the rest of us, to ordinary emotional limitations. The hard part is in finding a workable compromise. If you are Peary and have planned your every move down to the last jot and tittle, you could perhaps get away with carrying a Deke flag to the North Pole if it will make you feel good. After 18 years preparation, why not feel a little good? If you are an officer with the Franklin expedition and do not know what you are doing or where you are, but think you cannot eat food except from sterling silver tableware, you cannot get away with it. Wherever we go, there seems to be only one business at hand, that of finding workable compromises between the sublimity of our ideas and the absurdity of the facts of us. They made allowances for their emotional needs. Overwintering expedition ships commonly carried, in addition to sufficient fuel, equipment for the publication of weekly newspapers. The brave polar men sat cooling their heels in media's nowhere, reading in cold type their own and their bunkmates' gossip in such weekly as Perry's Winter Chronicle and North Georgia Gazette, Nansen's Franzja, or Scott's South Polar Times, and the Blizzard. Polar explorers also amuse themselves with theatrical productions. If one had been frozen into the pack ice off Rice Island near Antarctica, aboard Scott's ship Discovery, one midwinter night in 1902, one could have seen the only performance of Ticket of Leave, a screaming comedy in one act. Similarly, if in the dead of winter, 1819, one had been a member of young Edward Perry's expedition frozen into the pack ice in the high Arctic, one could have caught the first of a series of fortnightly plays, an uproarious success called Miss in Her Teens. According to Kerwin, this, Perry dryly remarked, afforded to the men such a fund of amusement as fully to justify the expectations we had formed of the utility of theatrical entertainments. And you yourself, Royal Navy Commander Edward Perry, were you not yourself the least bit amused? Or at 29 years old, did you still try to stand on your dignity? The land. God does not demand that we give up our personal dignity, that we throw in our lot with random people, that we lose ourselves and turn from all that is not him. God needs nothing, asks nothing, and demands nothing, like the stars. It is a life with God which demands these things. Experience has taught the race that if knowledge of God is the end, then these habits of life are not the means, but the condition in which the means operates. You do not have to do these things, not at all. God does not, I regret to report, give a hoot. You do not have to do these things unless you want to know God. They work on you, not on him. You do not have to sit outside in the dark. If, however, you want to look at the stars, you will find that darkness is necessary. But the stars neither require nor demand it, the technology. It is a matter for computation. How far can one walk carrying how much silver? The computer balks at the problem. There are too many unknowns. The computer puts its own question. Who is this one? What degree of stamina may we calculate for? Under what conditions does this one purpose to walk at what latitudes? With how many companions? How much aid? The people. The Mass has been building to this point, to the solemn saying of those few hushed phrases known as the Sanctus. We have confessed in a low, distinct murmur our sins. We have become the people broken, and then the people made whole by our reluctant assent to the priest's proclamation of God's mercy. Now, as usual, we will, in the stillest voice, stunned, repeat the Sanctus, repeat why it is that we have come. Holy, holy, holy Lord, God of power and might, heaven and earth are full of your glory. It is here, if ever, that one loses oneself at sea. Here, one's eyes roll up, and the sun rolls overhead, and the floe rolls underfoot, and the scene of unrelieved ice and sea rolls over the planet's pole and over the world's rim, wide and unseen. Now, just as we are dissolved in our privacy and about to utter the words of the Sanctus, the lead singer of Wildflowers bursts on stage from the wings. I raise my head. He is taking enormous enthusiastic strides and pumping his guitar's neck up and down. Drooping after him come the orange-haired country and western style woman, the soprano, who to shorten herself carries her neck forward like a horse, the withdrawn boy, and the Chinese man, who was holding a tambourine as if it had stuck by some defect to his fingers, and he has resolved to forget about it. These array themselves in a clump downstage right. The priest is nowhere in sight. Alas, alack, oh brother, we are going to have to sing the Sanctus. There is, of course, nothing new about singing the Sanctus. The lead singer smiles disarmingly. There is a new arrangement. He hits a chord with the flat of his hand. The Chinese man with sudden vigor bangs a tambourine and looks at his hands, startled. They run us through the Sanctus 3 or 4 times. The words are altered a bit to fit the strong, upbeat rhythm. Heaven and earth, 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 are full, 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 full of your glory. Must I join this song? May it keep only my silver? My backgammon board, I agree, is frivolity. I relinquish it. I will leave it right here on the ice. But my silver? My family crest? 1 knife, 1 fork, 1 spoon to carry beneath the glance of heaven and back? I have lugged it around for years. I am, I say, superlatively strong. Don't laugh. I am superlatively strong. Don't laugh. You'll make me laugh. The answer is no. We are singing the Sanctus, it seems, and they are passing the plate. I would rather, I think, undergo the famous dark night of the soul than encounter in church the dread hootenanny. But these purely personal preferences are of no account and maladaptive to boot. They are passing the plate, and I toss in my schooling. I toss in my rank in the Royal Navy, my erroneous and incomplete charts, my pious refusal to eat sled dogs, my watch, my keys, my shoes. I was looking for bigger game, not little moral lessons. But who can argue with conditions? Heaven and earth, 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 we sing. The withdrawn boy turns his head toward a man in front of me who must be his father. Unaccountably, the enormous teenage soprano catches my eye, exultant. A low shudder or shock crosses our flow. We have split from the pack. We have crossed the Arctic Circle, and the current has us. The land. We are clumped on an ice floe drifting over the black polar sea. Heaven and earth are full of our terrible singing. Overhead we see a blurred, colorless brightness. At our feet we see the dulled, swift ice and recrystallized snow. The sea is black and green. 100,000 floes and bergs float in the water and spin and scatter in the current around us everywhere as far as we can see. The wind is cool, moist, and scented with salt. I am wearing, I discovered, the uniform of Keystone Cop. I examine my hat, a black cardboard constable's hat with a white felt star stapled to the band above the brim. My dark Keystone Cop jacket is nicely belted, and there is a tin badge on my chest. A holster around my hips carries a pop gun with a cork on a string and a red roll of caps. My feet are bare, but I feel no cold. I am skating around on the ice and singing and bumping into people who, because the ice is slippery, bump into other people. Excuse me, I keep saying. I beg your pardon. Whoops there. When a crack develops in our flow and opens at my feet, I jump across it skillfully, I think, but my jump pushes my side of the flow away, and I wind up leaping full tilt into the water. The Chinese man extends a hand to pull me out, but alas, he slips and I drag him in. The Chinese man and I are treading water, singing and collecting a bit of a crowd. It takes a troupe of circus clowns to get us both out. I check my uniform at once and learn that my rather faltering hat is intact, my trousers virtually unwrinkled, but my roll of caps is wet. The Chinese man is fine. We thank the clowns. This troupe of circus clowns, I hear, is poorly paid. They are invested in bright, loose garments. They are a bunch of spontaneous, unskilled, oversized children. They joke and bump into people. At one end of the flow, 10 of them, red, yellow, and blue, are trying to climb up on each other to make a human pyramid. It is a wonderfully funny sight because they have put the 4 smallest clowns on the bottom, and the biggest, fattest clown is trying to climb to the top. The rest of the clowns are doing gymnastics. They tumble on the ice and flit cheerfully in midair. Their crucifixes fly from their ruffled necks as they flip and hit them on their bald heads as they land. Our flow is smaller now. We seem to have drifted into a faster bit of current. Repeatedly, we ram little icebergs, which rock as we hit them. Some of them tilt clear over like punching bags. They bounce back with great splashes, and water streams down their blue sides as they rise. The country and western-style woman is fending off some of the larger bergs with a broom. The lugs with the mustaches have found or brought a frisbee, and a game is developing down the middle of our flow. Near the frisbee game, a bunch of people, including myself and some clowns, are running. We fling ourselves down on the ice, shoulders first, and skid long distances like pucks. Now the music ceases, and we take our seats in the pews. A baby is going to be baptized. Overhead, the sky is brightening. I do not know if this means we have drifted farther north or all night. The people. The baby's name is Oswaldo. He is a very thin baby who looks to be about 1. He never utters a peep. He looks grim and stiff as a planked shad. His parents, his father carrying him, and his godparents, a priest and 2 acolytes, are standing on the ice between the first rows of pews on the linoleum-floored sacristy. I am resting my bare feet on the velvet prie-dieu to keep those feet from playing on the ice during the ceremony. Oswaldo is half Filipino. His mother is Filipino. She has a wide mouth with much lipstick and wide eyes. She wears a tight black skirt and stiletto heels. The father looks like Ozzie Nelson. He has marceled yellow hair, a blank, meek face, and a big, meek nose. He is wearing a brown leather flight jacket. The godparents are both Filipinos, one of whom, a pastel denim jumpsuit, keeps mugging for the Instamatic camera, which another family member is shooting from the aisle. The baby has a little red scar below one eye. He is wearing a long white lace baptismal gown, blue tennis shoes with white rubber toes, and red socks. The priest anoints the baby's head with oil. He addresses to the parents several articles of faith. Do you believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? Yes, we believe. The priest repeats a gesture, he says, with Christ explaining that it symbolically opens the infant's 5 senses to the knowledge of God. Uttering a formal prayer, he lays his hand loosely over Oswaldo's face and touches in rapid succession his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. The baby blinks. The priest, whose voice is sometimes lost in the ruff at his neck or blown away by the wind, is formal and gentle in his bearing. He knows the kid is cute, but he is not going to sentimentalize the sacrament. Since our flows spin, we in the pews see the broken flows and tilting bergs, the clogged, calm polar sea, and the variously lighted sky and the water's rim shift and revolve enormously behind the group standing around the baby. Once I think I see a yellowish polar bear spurting out of the water as smoothly as if climbing were falling. I see the bear splash and flow into a distant flowberg, which tilts out of sight. Now the acolytes bring a pitcher, a basin, and a linen towel. The father tilts the rigid baby over the basin. The priest pours water from the pitcher over the baby's scalp. The mother sops the baby with a linen towel and wraps it over his head so that he looks proudly as though he has just been made a swami. To conclude, the priest brings out a candle for the purpose. I think of pledging everybody to Christian fellowship with Oswaldo. Actually, I do not know what it is for. I'm not listening. I'm watching the hands at the candlestick. Each of the principals wraps a hand around the brass candlestick. The 2 acolytes with their small pale hands at its base, the 2 families, Oswaldo's and his godparents, with their vari-colored hands in a row, and the priest at the top, as though he has just won the bat toss at baseball. The baby rides high in his father's arms, pointing his heels in his tennis shoes, silent, wanting down. His father holds him firmly with one hand and holds a candlestick beside his wife's hand with the other. The priest and the seated members of Wildflower start clapping then, a round of applause for everybody here on the ice. So we clap. Months have passed, years have passed. Whatever ground gained has slipped away. New obstacles arise, and faintness of heart and dread. And I should probably stop here, right? Is that right?
It'll work.
I just want to make sure we have enough time between services. And so this goes on for a while, and it's very interesting. So any thoughts or comments? I know it's a lot. I'm like reading.
Nicely read.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Jenny Rebecca.
Hi, you're a beautiful reader. And
Thank you.
I came in late. I just wanted to check. Is this Annie Dillard?
Yes, this is Annie Dillard from Teaching a Stone to Talk. Yes. And inspired by you last week mentioning Annie Dillard. Yeah. Yep. Have you read this? Yeah. So.
I have that given to me by a wonderful teacher, that book.
Good. Yeah, awesome. Any other thoughts or comments?
It was great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Posey.
Wonderful tales.
Aren't they wonderful tales? I mean, she just, the way she weaves, to me, the way she just weaves in and out, I'm like, oh my gosh, how's she going to do this? Where is she going? And then she goes there and you're like, okay, I'm with you. So if you get a chance to find this in a library or buy it or borrow it from a friend, Teaching a Stone to Talk by Annie Dillard. Highly recommend anything by Annie Dillard. So thank you for letting me read today, and God bless you all, and have a great Sunday.